public are not buying it, and if you keep going the way you're going, they won't buy it for another year. Merry Christmas, Mr Speaker.
Order. The Honourable David Parker, 10 minutes.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. Mr Speaker, this year has seen a decline in the National Party's credibility. It's also seen a rise in the credibility of the Labour Party, and in particular by David Shearer. David Shearer's credibility has grown during the year and most forcefully in the last month. And I thought that was apparent in the speech that he gave in the House today. It was a mature speech, it had humour in it, it was not forced, it was the sort of speech you would expect of a senior politician. It wasn't, as the National Party have tried to characterise it, some sort of jokey speech which was addressing trained seals behind him. That was John Key's attempt at humour, which by contrast was shallow. Mr Speaker, I was asked earlier in the month what I thought of David Shearer's performance this year, and they asked me what his score was out of 10. And I didn't have a quick answer at the time, so I didn't really give a smart-ass answer. I'm not especially good at those, but I did think about it afterwards, and I thought, you know, what's the proper score for David Shearer out of 10 this year? Well, I think it's between 7 and 11, because that's the narrowing of the gap. That's the narrowing of the gap between National and Labour this year. The narrowing is gap. If you look at the worst of the polls, the narrowing of the gap is 7 points between Labour and National. If you look at the better of the polls, the narrowing of the gap is 11 points between National and Labour. The gap is narrowing. Mr Speaker, why is that? Why is it? Why is the National Party in decline in its credibility? Well, it's been a year of poor political management. It's been a year of scandal and mishap. The government's been diverted from paying attention to the proper management of the economy, and as a consequence we've got a stagnant economy and we've got record numbers of people going to Australia. The list of scandals and mistakes is longer than I've seen it since I've been in Parliament, and I've been here for a decade now. Just 1 year, just a year ago we had the tea tapes. We had the Prime Minister using the power of the state, disgracefully calling in the police against the media during an election. Lo and behold, a month or two after the election, they didn't want to proceed with the prosecution because it would have been so embarrassing for the Prime Minister and John Banks to turn up in court and pretend that their public stunt gone wrong was somehow an illegal action on the part of the media, the police of whom were used against them. Then we had the Prime Minister deeming Mr Ambrose guilty in a way in which he would never even do with John Banks, despite a written record showing that Mr Banks broke the law. Then we had the ACC debacle. We had Nick Smith having to resign because he, as ACC Minister, wrote a letter on behalf of Bronwyn Puller advocating for her, and then he misled the Prime Minister about having done so. So he had to fall on his sword, and then we had mayhem in ACC. We had Judith Collins kicking out the chair, losing the chief executive, most of the board, when we had privacy breaches, another scandal. What was next? We had the centrepiece of the budget being improved student outcomes through larger class sizes. What a nonsense. That was the end of the reputation of Hekia Parata, whose ignominy has been added to every time she stands up in the House and fails in her duty to act competently as a minister, yet still she stays on as Minister of Education. Bring back the Minister of Police into that role is what I never thought I would say that, Grant, but I saw that in a column from one of the commentators recently, and I thought, how far has the star of Hekia Parata fallen? So that also besmirched the reputation of the Minister of Finance, because he was the other driver for that policy. Then we had Murray McCulley and Foreign Affairs. What a disaster that was. Well brought to light by Phil Goff, who showed that he's more than a match for Mr McCulley. I'm maligning people in that house. I am maligning Mr McCulley because that too is terrible. Then we had pokey machines being traded for a convention centre. Then we had John Banks who sought donations, asked for them from Sky City, was given them personally in an envelope, knew that they were from Sky City and said they were anonymous. And then, of course, we had the link with .com and the fact that he said that he didn't know he had donations. That's already been covered by someone else. But the .com link then comes through in the next scandal that beset the National Party, which is a spy agency who, despite the fact that the residency for .com was celebrated in the largest display of fireworks ever, not just in Auckland, in the whole of New Zealand, paid for by .com, but the Keystone cops under Mr Key missed it. And then John Key forgot about it and forgot about it again and again. Meanwhile, what's happening to the economy? Well, the centrepiece of the government's economic program for this 3 years, asset sales, went off the rails. Asset sales was meant to be the biggest part of the economic plan for this country for this 3 years. That's right, he says, we won, you lost. That's Simon Bridges. New Zealanders lost, that right. That lack of, that hubris on the part of Simon is just, will come back to haunt him because, you know, asset sales were never a cure for the economic malaise of this country. Changing who owned what already existed did nothing to increase the output of New Zealand. It didn't create one extra new job. All it did was, over time, increase power prices. We know that because that was proven at Select Committee, and increased asset inequality over time, as those assets, instead of being owned by all New Zealanders, would end up owned disproportionately by the same 10% of New Zealand that this government always acts for. Mr Speaker, at budget time we also had disclosure for the first time, which again showed Stephen Joyce to be the chief spinner for the National Party. He was rolled out at the time of the last election to say that the Labour Party were telling lies when we said that they were accounting for the proceeds of sale of asset sales but weren't accounting for the loss of share of profits. Sure enough, come the budget, and they had to admit it, $100 million per annum worse deficit because of asset sales. Mr Speaker, in the meantime, what's happened to the economy? Well, the government promised that they would say goodbye to higher taxes, not your loved ones. That's what the National Party elected for in 2008. What's happened since? Record levels of people leaving New Zealand for Australia, the highest ever in the history of New Zealand, more than 175,000 since National took office. That's more than the population of Hamilton, it's more than the population of Napier and Hastings combined, it's more than the population of Dunedin and Invercargill combined. Some areas have lost 4% of their population. 4% of their population, Mr Speaker, and despite that record loss of people, we've got unemployment at the highest rate in 13 years, over 7%. What did the unemployment numbers do? They surprised the government. They said that they thought this was inconsistent, and yet the banks had already forecast it going to over 7%. The quarterly employment survey had also shown an increase in unemployment. We've had an increase in child poverty and inequality. I don't have time to cover that. I'm sure my colleague Jacinda Ardern will do that justice. Mr Speaker, we've had exports down. The government says there's no crisis in manufacturing. Well, it's true that primary manufacturing holds up when terms of trade go against you. That's true. But non-primary manufacturing really suffers, and that is what is suffering. We're losing jobs in that sector. This government refuses to pull the levers of power that are open to it. They say that the Labour Party stands for nothing different. We stand for a neutral investment signal which is fair through a capital gains tax that also improves the economy. Universal KiwiSaver. Changes to the Reserve Bank Act so that the Reserve Bank doesn't give primacy to inflation targeting over things like the exchange rate and in full employment. Mr Speaker, last thing I would say is the messaging of the government is now becoming desperate. For years they've said we were in Labour fiscally irresponsible. Then just this week we've got John Key saying $20 billion of surpluses in 3 years under Labour, and because of that we didn't spend enough on child poverty, despite the fact that we lifted many people out of child poverty through working for families. The truth is we were responsible fiscally. We have partially rehabilitated our reputation in respect of fiscal responsibility this year. Mr Speaker, we left the lowest government debt in the world, the lowest unemployment in the world, and this government has squandered that advantage.
The Honourable Anne Tolley, 5 minutes.